Hi you guys, welcome back. My name is Carrie Penny. I am the Happy Crafty Homemaker, and today we're going to be discussing the difference between wool and superwash wool. Pippin is down here on the floor, and he just gave a huge stretch and a yawn and started moving things around on the floor. I also think Banner's coming down the hall too, so. Anywho, so I do have notes. So if you see me kind of looking down or trying to figure out where I am, I got notes. First off, one of the things I wanted to address is, as we're talking about wool, we are specifically talking about sheep's wool in this conversation. Wool can, in the textile industry, be any type of hair harvested. I mean, you can have camel wool, possum wool. So any mammal fiber that is what would be a keratin-based hair protein. But in this case, we are specifically talking about sheep's wool, as that is the most common generic wool we see discussed in yarn arts. So, that having been said, first point is any animal hair could be considered wool. There you go. If you have experience with human hair, if you are a dyeing expert, in particular, perming and dyeing, a lot of these things you will vaguely understand, especially as we go further into this series as we're talking about different things. But when my hairstylist and I frequently talk, it's like, she's always like, how do you know that? Why is that? It's like, I've dyed wool before. I'm familiar with dyeing animal fiber. So, you know, this is just another keratin protein hair, just like wool is. So you will actually understand some of the finer points of this. I am not going to get into staple length or micron count for any of this, as we are just talking about what is called general wool. We're not talking about BFL. We're not talking about Merino. We are literally just comparing and processing unprocessed natural wool versus superwash wool in this video. So a lot of you guys that come to my channel are relatively new to the knitting and crochet game, and I realize as I've been working on socks and talking about some of the things that I have come across that have kind of been like, now I'm worried. Y'all had no idea what I was talking about. A couple of you guys have reached out and asked some of these questions. So this will become a regular series here, at least until I get bored doing research on these things to share with you guys. There's a lot for me to learn as well. So buckle up. This is our introduction video to the wonderful world of what fibers do what and where. So wool versus superwash wool, I thought was a great place to start, because those are some of the most common natural fibers we see in our community being used. Like I said, wool comes from any mammal that produces a lot of hair. So there are a lot of different types of wool out on the market. In this case, we are talking about sheep's wool and the difference between the unprocessed and processed wool and what that means to us on the end making with it. So I'm going to insert a picture here so you can understand when I talk about scales. Human hair has scales as well, but wool has scales on it. And these scales are very important to the conversation of unprocessed versus superwash wool. So if you've ever bleached your hair out and gotten it to the white stage of bleaching and then tried to put red dye in it, you will have noticed that the red washes out very quickly. If your hair's been over processed, it could wash out as quickly as your first time washing it, even if it's a permanent dye going into your hair. And that is because the red molecule is very large, and red is very hard to take. We also see this in wool. So that particular dye molecule is very, very large. So it's very hard to get very saturated color. So if you have over processed your hair and you don't fill the scales first, which is why you see a lot of people dyeing their hair like brunette before they put in red dye, especially if they're like stripping out color to put red in, the red molecule will just fall right out if your hair's been over processed. If your hair has been properly processed, the red may not take as quickly. And it's because those scales have not opened up enough to accept the red dye, or in the case that it washes out very quickly, you have processed it so that scale stays open and the red dye just falls right back out. So while it takes initially, the molecule just falls right back out because your hair is not coming back into a smooth texture as in the picture here. So scales are cool. How these scales work in unprocessed wool, one of the things that is very characteristic of a non-superwash wool is that it will felt. So when you shock wool by changing the temperature of the wool, those scales will open. To process hair, we tend to bleach it to open up those to remove the color and to put new color in. For processing or for playing with wool, temperature is all you necessarily need to do that. So those scales will open up, like say if you put it in hot water, and if you create agitation while it's in that hot water, those scales will clip onto each other and create felting, which is a really neat thing. But if you properly care for natural unprocessed wool and you're not trying to get a felted effect, and you soak it in, say, room temperature water, one of the things you will see as you first finish a project is the wool will swell, your yarn will swell. A lot of people call this blooming. And once it has dried from that state, you get this nice smoother effect that's kind of got a halo to it. And that is because of the nature of how these scales react to their environment and how we handle the wool. Superwash wool is treated by a number of different methods in order to etch or remove the scales from the wool and then coat the wool so it stays very smooth. So in hair care, you might say use a keratin product that is going to coat the strand of hair to prevent it from being frizzy or kind of fill in where maybe you have over processed your hair and it does not have a smooth texture to the hair shaft anymore. So you might use something like keratin to coat your hair. So in superwash, what you're doing is you're blasting those scales so they either have etched to not move, the end will not move away from the core of the wool fiber. You either etch them or blast them off. Generally during a chemical process, most commonly a chlorine-based process. And then there are a couple of different ways to fill the yarn is my understanding, but there's a micro resin that tends to be what is used to then smooth the final product. So you're creating frayed ends intentionally, blasting off the scales, and then you smooth it back out just like you would use keratin to smooth back out the frizziness from over processing your hair. Because basically what you're doing is you're over processing wool and then smoothing it back out. And that is what makes it a superwash wool. It is no longer, the scales are no longer going to open and close and grab onto each other when they're exposed to higher temperatures of water. And they're not going to react to the agitation of washing a garment or washing a pair of socks or whatever it is you're using this product for. So it's a very neat process. Now there is also a way of using natural salts and an oxidizer. And there is another process, and I can't remember what any of these are called, but there is another process that uses extreme temperature control in order to create the etching, and then there is another product that is used to refill it. So you are literally, it's kind of like when you sandblast something before painting it. That's kind of what you're doing here. You're priming the fiber to then smooth it out. Lots of different ways to come at this in analogies, but yeah. So as part of the processing for superwash wool, one of the things you do happen, like I mentioned with hair, you know, you do want to open the follicle of your hair before you put dye in so your hair can take in the molecule. You want to open those cuticles, open those scales. One of the things that is really cool with the superwash process is when you dye that yarn, it is more accepting, that wool is now more accepting of the dye molecules. Now, I have personally found that if not properly treated with acid and rinsed, you will get a little bit more bleeding from a lot of the superwash just because it will hang on to the fiber. But by and large, most of them are fairly color safe, color fast after they've been properly dyed. But they do accept color deeper. It penetrates more into the core of the wool fibers. So you get a much more saturated color, a brighter color. It totally changes how the wool can accept that dye. So you're going to use an acid-based dyeing method for either a natural wool or a superwash wool, but how that color turns out is determined on how that wool has been processed or not processed beforehand. It does make a big difference. You also have a difference of texture. So in the thumbnail, both of these are merino wool. This is a non-superwash merino wool. They are spun differently, but this is a superwash merino wool. You can see how much shinier this looks, how much smoother this looks, whereas this one has much more of a halo. So you can definitely tell a difference in just the texture of the yarn. The process of blasting the scales and then smoothing it for the superwash does give you more of a sheen. It gives you a smoother effect, whereas with the untreated, just plain old merino, once again, we've got haloing, and you can see that the texture is a more matte texture. Now, this will affect your final projects. Like, these are things that I personally think are very important to understand how these fibers are treated in order to create the difference we see. So because the superwash is so smooth, you get really crisp stitch definition. So for something like color work, because now you not only do you get super crisp color definition, but because it takes dye better and you can get a more saturated color, a more intense color with the superwash wool, things like color work can really pop with a superwash wool. It is really cool how changing the yarn can be different. So if you were to do color work with wool, like I said, if it's properly cared for and treated, it's soaked and has an opportunity to, you know, bloom into itself, you almost have more of like this, it's more like a watercolor effect to me versus say like mosaic tile that you can get with these sharp crisp points of these superwash. They're both beautiful. They both are just different from each other, and the way these things interact with each other are very different. So I love both forms of color work, both fibers for color work, but they do behave very differently as far as what your final product will look like. That doesn't mean you won't have any stitch definition and it's all going to be a hazy blur if you use unprocessed non-superwash wool. It's just you're going to have a much sharper, crisper, pixelated effect that is more intense with the superwash versus the non-superwash wool. I did mean in the processing section, want to mention one of the reasons why I said it is a chlorine-based process that is used for most superwash wools even today, is there is a lot of ecological impact because of this, as it is chlorine based. You do have a lot of water that is used in the process of superwash wool. You do also have toxic chemicals with the chlorine that are run off wastewaters because of the way superwash wool is processed. So if this is something that is important to you, reducing your impact, be aware of that is how it is processed. Now, technology has developed more and more, and like I said, there are natural salts and oxidizers that are used to also make superwash wool. So maybe investigate where, like say, a dyer is getting their basis from, or if you are a dyer, where you're purchasing your basis from and how they are producing their superwash, the superwash nature of their wool. But that's where that you buy where you're comfortable. You do what you got to do within where you're comfortable. I'm not going to judge you one way or the other. If you do already own superwash wool, don't waste it. The impact has already been made. Don't waste it. That would just be pointless ecological, I don't want to say trauma, but I mean, it's already been done. Use what you have. And if this is a problem for you, the way wool is processed, definitely use an unprocessed wool. There's nothing wrong with that. There are lots of dyers that are very aware of their ecological impact. I've been highlighting one specifically with my current review series on subscription boxes with my Little Skein subscription box. So if you are interested in more eco-conscious dyeing methods, definitely come check out the videos where I'm talking about Anne and her dyeing process in my first month's unboxing with the Little Skeins. You can also, once again, develop a relationship with the dyers that you purchase from and find dyers that meet your ecological, where you are on the spectrum. I don't want to harp on here about that, but I do think it's something important to be aware of, especially if these are things that are important to you. Part of the processing with the superwash wool does mean that it's going to lose some of the elasticity. Depending on what you're making, this is a good thing, bad thing. Because you have lost some of that elasticity and it's not going to draw up as quickly, it's not going to back into place as quickly, you do also have increased drape. So for something like a shawl where you do definitely want a drape to your final fabric, superwash is actually going to be kind of one of those higher things. That doesn't mean, once again, that an unprocessed wool is not drapey. There are drapey unprocessed wools. A lot of it can depend on the needle size you're using, the size yarn you're using, the project you're making, the density of the stitches you're using. There are a lot of factors here, but you will get more drape with the superwash wool as the nature of the process that it has gone through to be superwash. However, it does lose some of that elasticity of the fiber. When fibers draw up over time after we block them, they kind of relax into whatever shape they're going to be into. You can soak a natural wool, an unprocessed wool item, and kind of reshape it, and it will retake its shape, whereas you're going to have less of that over time with its superwash counterpart. Once again, it's just the nature of the beast. It's kind of what happens when you process off that scaling. It doesn't have any way of contracting back up against that core, so those scales do add structure to the individual fibers within the yarn there. Untreated is going to gauge a little bit smaller because, once again, it's going to zip up into itself a little bit more than the superwash treated wool will. Superwash also, when you're talking about things like sweaters and outerwear pieces, the superwash wool is going to absorb more water quicker. So if you're wanting to make a sweater, and say you go out on a drizzly day, the yarn itself is going to hold more water quicker, and it's going to penetrate closer to your skin level than, say, an untreated wool will. The scales on the untreated wool make a natural hydrophobic barrier, and the wool itself will not absorb and take in the water nearly as quickly, keeping the water away from your skin level. So if you're in a colder climate where moisture can be very detrimental, that may be something you want to be aware of, especially if you live in a moist, cold climate. But that was something I really hadn't considered until I started doing a little bit more research. I kind of knew most of this, like on the surface level, but that was one that I really hadn't considered as I live in a moist, hot climate. That's not one that has a direct impact for me. Now, as we get further into this series of videos, we will be discussing different types of wool, and different types of wool also have different hydrophobic principles, meaning that they repel the water more. Certain wools are better at doing that. Certain wools are a little bit denser. Certain wools do different things differently. We're talking about the greater spectrum of wools here, or anything that's just listed as wool. But there are subcategories even under that. So that is something we will come to in a future video. The last note I made here is really funny. Swatch and block, important! Exclamation point. So if you are looking at making, in particularly, a larger project with a wool, or any wool in general, I think, especially if it's a newer fiber to you, it is very important to swatch and block and see how it is actually, how that yarn is going to behave in your project. There are times where the dyeing process on an untreated wool will affect the scales. There are certain times where a dyer style may actually create mild felting on the yarn, and that is going to behave very differently. So as a general rule, especially when making garments, I always recommend doing a gauge swatch. That way you can see how the yarn is going to behave in your project. Now, one thing I want to just kind of like slip in here at the tail end of this, and this is just because this is a common question that I get in general about what can I do, what can I make, what can I use. You can mix and match superwash and non-superwash wool. There is nothing wrong with that. You can use, you know, an 85-25 with a 70-30 blend. None of this matters. At the end of the day, if you're getting the texture and look of your finished project that you are looking for, you can mix and match these fiber types. However, your final care for your finished object is going to depend on the most delicate fiber you use in that project. So if, say, I wanted to make a sweater combining these two yarns, I would need to care for it based on this yarn, which is hand wash, cool water, lay flat to dry. Whereas this one is superwash. It says technically I can put this in the machine to wash it with a non-soap detergent. This one needs a soak. So I would have to care for it based on the most delicate care instructions for the fiber. I get that question a lot. It's a very common question that I get. And, you know, I always say, do what you like. But when it comes to your final object, you do need to care for it based on the most delicate directions of the most delicate yarn that you used in your project. So I'm going to leave this here. If you have any further questions of the superwash versus non-superwash wool question, leave them down below. If I don't know the answer, my community is phenomenal at answering each other's questions. I will also try to help guide you to a person who might know more than I do. This is just kind of a little primer, a basic introduction into the world of wool versus superwash wool, and what does that mean for us as knitters and crocheters and our final experience in using these yarns in our projects. So leave any questions, comments down below. I love hearing from you guys. Take care of yourselves. I love you, and I will see you guys real soon. I keep putting this in the wrong spot. I still need to make a holder for my clicker. I love you guys. I will see y'all real soon. Bye, guys.